In this video we're going to look at the django-cotton component package, and this package brings component-based design to Django templates, and it dispenses with some of these template tags that you might be commonly using in Django, such as extends, block, include, and custom tags, and it can replace that with this very nice HTML-like syntax. If we look at view.html on the left-hand side, you can see we have a lot of the Django template tags, but a much more modern approach would be to use django-cotton on the right-hand side, where you have the component and you declare it with the angle brackets that you're used to declaring HTML elements with. And you can pass attributes into the component from the parent template, and that's then going to be rendered inside the component itself using the normal Django template variable syntax. Now there are some good component packages in Django, for example Django components, which we did a video on, and also slippers, which we did a video on as well. And we also have packages like Django Unicorn that help to bring that kind of design to Django. But in my opinion, having used this a little bit, django-cotton has the potential to be my favourite, just because it's so easy to declare these components. There's such little setup involved, as we're going to see very soon in the video. Now if you're interested in a comparison between all of those different component packages, let me know in the comments and we'll consider a video on that later on. And one other thing to note about django-cotton, it works very well with Alpine.js and also with HTMX, so we might consider some videos on that as well. Now before we start, make sure to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this content. And if you want to support the channel, we have this Ko-fi page in the description. Let's get started and go back to the django-cotton documentation. So let's go down and we're going to look at these cards here about why you might want to choose django-cotton in your project. So for example, rapid UI composition, we can very efficiently compose, and importantly we can reuse UI components. And that can help streamline your workflow and boost your productivity. And this package will work very well with Tailwind CSS and that utility-first approach that Tailwind has. So you can imagine designing, for example, a button component or a card like these, and adding the styles from Tailwind into that django-cotton component, and then reusing that in multiple places. And Cotton is also interoperable with Django templates. And the HTML tag-like syntax can enhance your productivity, and that's because it's going to allow code editors to recognize the components as HTML elements, and that's a benefit over some of the other component packages that I mentioned in the start of the video. And finally, we also have minimal overhead, so Cotton will compile to native Django components, and that compilation step is automatically cached and dynamically managed. Now let's go to the quick start just now. And what we're going to do to start with is install the package. So I'm going to copy this command and I'm going to open VS Code. So I'm now in VS Code and I have a very simple Django project, and I've activated a Python virtual environment. So let's paste in the pip install command, and that's going to install this package into the environment. Once that's installed, we can set the package up. So let's minimize the terminal and go back to the documentation. So first of all, we need to add django-cotton to our installed apps. Let's go back to this setting here, and that needs to be a string. Once we have it in installed apps, we can go back to the documentation and we're going to amend the template setting. Now there's a couple of things we need to do. First of all, to this setting here for directories, we need to add our project and a templates subdirectory. So let's do that just now. Let's go back to the settings.py file, and it's the templates setting here. Now the project directory, I've called it Cotton Demo. What we're going to do here is add a subdirectory called templates, and we can reference that here in this directory setting. So it's Cotton Demo and then /templates. So what we're doing here is just basically telling Django to expect to find templates in this directory, and we can set app directories to false for this video, and that matches the documentation, and I think that's required by django-cotton. We're then going to add a couple of extra settings, so the loaders inside the options dictionary, we're going to add that just now. So let's copy this and go back to the settings.py file, and I'm going to paste in the loaders list here, and then we can add a comma here to separate it from the context processors. So Django has some default loaders, and we're going to add the django-cotton specific loader that comes from that package to this setting. So inside the options dictionary, we have loaders and context processors. We're also going to add a third option for built-ins. So I'm going to copy this here, and let's go back to the setting and we're going to paste that in. And this is really all the setup we need to do to get django-cotton working and to actually start writing components. Very easy to set up. We just add it to installed apps and modify the template setting. So let's now create a component. I'm going to go back to the documentation for django-cotton, and we have a page here for components. Now components in django-cotton are designed to be reusable, and they can contain native Django template syntax and can be used inside of standard Django templates. So a minimal example here would be to have a component that just has a slot, and then inside your normal Django template, you define that component here, or rather you reference the component with some child content that is then inserted into the slot. So basically the component only contains a slot for any child content, and in this case that's going to be this paragraph tag. So if we go down here, the slot variable will contain all of the content provided between the opening and closing tag of the current component, as defined in the parent. If we go back to the quick start just now, what I'm going to do is go down here to this create a component section, and let's just follow this example for now. So what we're going to do inside our templates directory is create a cotton subdirectory, and django-cotton can then find our templates or components that we define inside that subdirectory. So let's start by doing that, and we're going to add a card.html file inside that directory. So within our cotton demo templates directory, let's create another one called cotton, and we're going to create a file in here, and let's just give it the same name as the documentation. We'll create our own component in a second, but we're going to paste in the code here, and that's going to define our component. So it's in a card.html file, and the component has a div with some classes here. And you can see this card has a title inside an h2 tag. The slot is inside a paragraph tag. And finally, we have a button with an href, and that's using Django's URL template tag, and it's referencing a URL that's going to be passed into the component. So then if we go back to the documentation, what we can do is include a component. So here we have a Django view function that returns dashboard.html, and inside that dashboard.html file, you can see that we are including the component using this syntax. So basically the syntax is C dash, that specifies it as a cotton component, and then we have the name of the component, and that comes from the name of the HTML file that's used to define that component. And we can pass in the properties such as the title here and the URL for that given component. And then the slot is going to come from the child content. And you can see that when we do this, the preview below is what's actually rendered out using Django. And we have cards with the title, with the content that's coming from the slot, and also the link here. Now what we're going to do is go back to VS Code, and we're going to take it from here. But notice that this component is using classes from Tailwind CSS. So what we're going to do is install Tailwind into our project. We're going to keep it simple in this video and just use a CDN. So let's copy this script tag here from the CDN, and there's a link to this page in the description of the video. We're going to go back to Django and go to a base.html file that we're using. I'm going to paste that in here. So we're loading Tailwind into the project. And then in our index file where we extend that base template, we're going to reference the component that we've just created for the card, and automatically, because we're including the base template here, we're going to get access to Tailwind classes. So what we're going to do is clear the terminal, and we're going to start the Django development server, and we're going to go to localhost 8000 here. And when we go to this page, it's currently completely empty. There's nothing on the page at all. What we're going to do now is go back to the template here, and we're going to go back to the documentation for django-cotton, and we're going to reference this component in the template. So I'm just going to copy this, and we're going to define that here. And what I'm going to do is change the URL to one that we have in the application. So I'm going to reference the index URL from this URL pattern here, and that's because we need to have a valid URL in order for this to work. So we're passing a title of trees and a URL of index, and then we have the slot content here. We have the best trees, and if we save this and go back to the page, when we refresh the page, you can see we are now getting a card. So that's how easy it was to install django-cotton, set it up using the template setting, and then start defining components that we can then include in our project. And we can change this, for example, to have a second component. Instead of trees, let's just give it the title forest. And then if we refresh again, we get back the content. Now to get the styles a bit more similar to what we have here, I'm going to add some Tailwind classes to this. So we can target our component, and let's go back to this card.html file. So to the header2 tag, we're going to add some Tailwind classes. Let's give it some larger text with the text2XL class, and we'll give it some margin bottom as well to separate it a bit from the paragraph. Now the paragraph is going to have some classes as well. Let's give that just one class of margin bottom 2. If we save that and go back to the page, we can see that it's already looking slightly better. It's got larger text here for the heading, and everything is separated a bit more by the margins. And finally, we can style up this button here. This is actually supposed to be a button, but currently there are no styles. So let's go to that button, and we're going to define some classes from Tailwind here. So let's just start by defining a class of text blue 400. What I'm going to do actually here is just change this button to an anchor tag. So we're going to give it a class of text blue 400. Let's go back to the page. That looks more like a link now. And when we hover over it, we can change the styles as well. So I'm going to do that just now. So on hover, what we can do is change the color to text blue 500. So we're going to make it slightly darker when we hover over the element. Let's save this and go back to the page. And you can see it's becoming slightly darker here. I think you can see that as we hover over the text. Now, as well as hard coding the data that we're passing in here, if we go back to the project and look at index.html, we just are hard coding this at the moment. But this data could come from the context that we're passing from the Django view into the template. And that context can usually be derived from something like the database. And what we're going to do in this video is go to views.py, and I'm going to hard code some context here. Now I'm actually going to do that just above the function here. So I'm hard coding this data, and actually I got this data just directly from a language model by asking it to generate data with this schema. So we have a name, a description, and a URL. And this is a list of products, and each product in the list is a dictionary containing those three keys. So we have these products now. Let's go back to the view function, and we're going to add a key to the context called products, and let's set that equal to the variable above. Of course, in a real application, this would come from the database or from an API or something, but we're just going to hard code it for now and go back to index.html. So what we're going to do here is remove the second card. We don't need that anymore. And what we're going to do here is create a Django template for loop. So we're going to iterate over each product in the list of products. And let's tab the card over and end the for loop below. So for each product, we want to pass a title that's going to be equal to the product's name. So product.name. If we look at views.py and go back to our data here, each dictionary contains a name, and we can access dictionary keys inside our templates just by using this dot notation. We're also going to pass the URL here, so we're going to reference product.url. And finally, inside the content itself for this card, we're going to pass product.description. So this time the attributes that we're passing into the django-cotton component, they are coming directly from data that we've added to the context and that we're iterating over here in this for loop. Now let's save this, and in fact before we do, let's go back to card.html. What I'm going to do here is change the href because we are no longer referencing a URL in our application. We're just going to hard code this to the URL that we're using, or that we're passing into the template. So that's because if we go back here to products, we look at the URL. This is an absolute URL. It doesn't exist in our application. It's an external URL. So on the card, we just want to reference that here. And that's in the href property. Let's now go back to our application and refresh this. And this time you can see the data is being rendered dynamically from what we've added to the context. And we've got one of these cards on each line here. And we can change that as well if we want. So if we want to change the structure of this page or the layout, we could use something like CSS Grid for that. So very quickly, I'm going to do that just now. Let's go back to index.html. And just above the for loop, let's define a div that's going to use some classes from Tailwind for CSS Grid. First of all, we give it the grid class, and that's going to use display grid under the hood. And we're going to give it 4 columns by using grid calls 4. And don't forget to close that div just below the for loop here. So if we save this and go back to the page now and refresh this page, you can see we now have a grid system with 4 columns, and we have 8 cards here, so that's taking up 2 rows in that grid. And if we wanted, we could also add some gap between them. So let's go back to this, and it's one class from Tailwind. Let's say it's gap2, and that's going to add a gap along the X and the Y axis of this grid. So when we refresh the page, you can see that the cards are now separated by a small gap. So it's very easy using CSS Grid to create these flexible layouts, and we can encapsulate the style and the code for the individual cards inside our component. So I think this is very nice. It's very easy to do this. We have very HTML-like syntax, and we can pass data into the component very easily. And I think it really fits my mental model of how a component should be defined in an HTML template, and get all of the benefits of being able to use Django template variables as well as other expressions as we're about to see. Now, just while we're on CSS Grid, one last thing I want to show is how we could make this more responsive. So you can see that as the screen size gets smaller here, the styles are not looking particularly good and they're overflowing the card. So what we could do here is just add some other classes from Tailwind to control this. So imagine on very small screens, we want each card to take up the full line. So we can actually use the block class for this. And then when we hit the small screens, we can use this small modifier and reference the grid. And similarly, when we have small screens, we're going to add grid calls 4 and gap 2. So I'm going to save this and we're going to see if it works first of all. So let's refresh the page, and I'm going to make this smaller, and you can see that by default the cards are taking up one single line when we have very small screens. And then when we hit this breakpoint here, we're getting the cards appearing 4 in a line. So actually we might want to add another breakpoint. So I'm going to go back here. So on small screens, we're going to change from block to grid. But let's say on small screens, we only want 4 columns. And on medium screens, we're going to add grid calls 4 here. And we add the gap 2 to small screens, and that's going to propagate up through medium and larger screens. So what's going on here is that we have 2 columns on small devices, and then when we hit larger devices, we're going to split that into 4 columns and show 4 cards in that row. Let's test this out again and go back to the page. This time you can see we have 2 columns. When we go beyond that breakpoint, we're down to the block level content, so it's 1 card per row. When we hit the breakpoint, we go to 2 cards, and that's because of the grid calls 2. And then if we get to the medium sized screen, we go to 4 columns, and you can very easily create flexible and responsive layouts by using CSS Grid in combination with some kind of component system like django-cotton. One last thing to show, we might want to actually add more gap on the y-axis here. So for example, we have a small gap on the x-axis, that's fine. But on the y-axis, we might want more space, so we can separate these out. So rather than just using gap, we can specify gap x and gap y classes. So I'm going to copy this and let's paste that in here. And we're going to say gap y is going to be slightly bigger on that axis. So for small screens and above, we have a gap of 2 on the x-axis and 4 on the y-axis. Let's save this and go back to the page, and hopefully we're going to see the space between the rows is getting slightly bigger when we refresh, and you can see that now. Now that's enough about CSS Grid. Let's show some last things that we can do with django-cotton. Now we can also use template filters when we pass data into the component. So for example, this title here, it's using product.name, and that shows up here in the card. Let's imagine for some reason we want to lowercase that or do any kind of operation. What we can do is pass a template filter such as lower, and if we save that, when we pass that into the component, you can see that it's lowercased all of the titles. And let's also imagine that the content we're passing in here for the description, we don't want that going above a certain number of characters. So here we have product.description. We can use the Django truncate characters template filter, and we can pass a number of characters to that. For example, 50 characters if we want to limit the description to 50 characters maximum. When we refresh this, you can see that after 50 characters, we get these ellipses. So it's very easy in django-cotton to adapt the data that you're passing into the component just by using native Django template filters. And of course, you could define your own filters as well if you want to use those. Now, the final thing I want to show here is that the slot content that we pass into the component, remember that comes between the card declaration and the end of the card. We can actually pass dynamic HTML in here as well. So what I'm going to do is copy a button that I've prepared, and I'm going to paste that into this slot here. So that's a button that has these classes from Tailwind, and it's got the text by, and that's added alongside the description here as the child content that's passed into the card. And remember, in django-cotton, you can accept that content using the slot variable. So if we go back to the page after saving that and refresh this page, you can see we now have this rather ugly buy button. But the point of this example is just to show how easy it is to actually pass dynamic HTML into the django-cotton component if you want to render that as part of the slot. And I think this might look better if the buy button was on a new line. So I'm going to add a block class here to give it the display of block. And you can see now the buy button is here. When we hover over that, we're getting some styling here. The background color is slightly darker, and it's also getting slightly larger, the button. If you want to know why that's happening, that's because on the hover here, we're changing the background color. And also when we hover, we're using the scale 105 class from Tailwind. And basically what the scale 105 class is doing is it's taking the element that it's defined on, this button, and it's going to scale it up by whatever percentage equates to 105. In that case, it's going to be 105% of the original size. So it's going to get slightly bigger, as you can see here. And if you wanted to change that to something else, we could perhaps do that. So let's try scale 125. I think that might work. If we refresh the page, this time you can see it's getting larger here. So you can play about with all of these settings. Tailwind is amazingly adaptable, and I think it works really nicely with these django-cotton components. So overall, I have to say I really love this approach from django-cotton of having this HTML-like syntax where we can actually define a component, pass in properties, pass in some slot data or content, and then have that all rendered and reusable within a simple HTML file. And the only setup we need to do is just amending our templates in the Django settings module. As soon as we've done that and we've told Django where to find the cotton subdirectory, we can basically start using django-cotton. and we can start making pieces of our web page reusable and styling those pieces up using something like Tailwind. And I think that's a much nicer developer experience than just relying on native Django template expressions. But of course, if you have any other opinions, let me know in the comments as well. And this is going to integrate very easily with something like HTMX or Alpine.js. We can just add whatever HTMX attributes we need or whatever Alpine directives we need into our components, and that can help make our page more responsive and interactive, and it can help make the components themselves capable of doing more complex things. So I'd like to explore that in a future video. If you're interested, let me know in the comments. And there are some other features of Django-cotton that we've not looked at, so hopefully we can explore those in the future as well. So thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to support the channel, check the Ko-fi link we have in the description, and we'll see you in the next video.